Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the Friday Public Health Seminar. It's great to see all of you here. And of course, we have a fantastic topic today. And I was just thinking that it's the most beautiful juxtaposition in public health of smoking and endgame. And so we're going to hear more about that today. And two great speakers. As you know, Richard Edwards is a professor here and has a long association with looking at tobacco control. And Louise Thornley, more recently, has been involved in Aspire. And I think it's a terribly motivating thing, the league tables comparing how is New Zealand going compared with the rest of the world. And so over to our speakers to tell us.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much, Michael, for that good, succinct introduction. Much appreciated. So I'm going to speak first just to give you some introduction. Why is this not? That was going just before. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to introduce New Zealand's goal, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and a new international endgame project that Richard and I are involved with, and some quick comments on other countries' context and status, and then Richard's going to give early thoughts on what we can learn from these other countries and how New Zealand compares. And the reason it says early thoughts is because the project just started late last year, and so we're not presenting findings as such, but more our preliminary thoughts from what we've gathered so far. So back in 2010, the Maori Affairs Select Committee did an extensive inquiry, which I'm sure you all know about, and there were some really strong Maori leaders involved with advocating for this goal. This is a photo of May and Brigham Riwai Couch, who were aged 7 and 9 at the time, and they gave, as part of their whānau's submission to the inquiry, a coffin that they'd made out of cigarette packs, which was their response to losing their grandfather from lung cancer quite recently. So this was just one of the moving stories in the thousands of submissions to that inquiry. And in 2011, the government responded to the inquiry with setting a goal to be a smoke-free country by 2025. And this is generally accepted as aiming for less than 5% smoking prevalence by 2025. And that's for all ethnic groups in New Zealand, not just the overall population. So moving to 2018, we still have quite inadequate progress towards this goal, as I'm sure many of you will be aware when you look at the stats. There isn't yet a government strategy to guide actions to achieve the goal, so that's quite a major gap. And in 2017, a collaboration of experts and practitioners got together and created a comprehensive action plan based on evidence to help fill this gap and to get input from a wide range of practitioners, NGOs, academics, Māori and Pacific communities, to have a say in that project and to contribute to making recommendations for action. And this is a photo of May and Brigham again, this time 7 years later, and they came along to our launch and spoke really eloquently. So 7 years later, they're teenagers and they're still pushing to have a smoke-free Aotearoa. So modelling by the Bode team here at Otago University shows really clearly that we're currently way off track towards meeting the goal. This graph looks at if we continued with 10% tax increases, the goal wouldn't be achieved until well after 2025 for the total population, and not until 2060 or beyond for Māori, which is completely unacceptable, and no one wants that situation. So I think this really implies that we do need to start being bolder in what we're doing. And there's been a movement in tobacco control for about the last up to 20 years really, called endgame thinking, and Ruth Malone in the States has termed it imagine things otherwise. So it's quite different to traditional tobacco control, which even by its name implies that tobacco is still going to be around to control. But this is really rejecting the status quo and setting a date for elimination or near elimination by a specified date. and ideally moving to complete elimination shortly after the date. So this requires new, bold ideas, and there's a range of policies that researchers have been exploring, including things like large reductions in tobacco retail availability, modifying the product, so removing additives or reducing the nicotine content drastically to very low levels. In some contexts, it might be feasible to reduce imports gradually, particularly thinking of small Pacific countries that may be in a position to be able to realistically do that as an endgame strategy. And there's a whole lot of other ones, smokers' licenses and tobacco-free generation. There's no end of great ideas. So with that context in mind, we initiated a project late last year to start documenting and disseminating progress and status among several countries that have similar endgame goals. We agreed the aims with the countries at a meeting in Cape Town, which unfortunately I didn't get to go to, but Richard did. And so he facilitated the meeting. There was about 20 people from all the countries that we're involving at this stage. And so they agreed these aims. And yeah, so basically the project has formally begun. And so far we've developed some criteria for selecting the countries. And the main one is that at this stage we're focusing on countries with national goals. So even though the Pacific region has a goal as well, we haven't included them yet because it's a regional goal across many countries. And so at this stage, we're just starting with countries that have similar national level goals. But in future, we do plan to involve Pacific countries as well. And we designed a template to get information from the countries on their goals and the context, the progress towards the goal, what interventions they're using, what types of approaches, etc. And this was based on the tobacco control scale, which is used in European countries to compare how they're implementing various initiatives in tobacco control. But we also added some other questions and emailed it out to the 6 countries. And the contacts that we've developed in each country are a mix of people from government, NGOs, and academic institutions. So it's quite a mix of people, and we asked them to collaborate within country to fill out the template and agree on it and then send it to us in one form. And so far that's working okay. We're gradually getting that content finalised. And we've just drafted a summary document to summarise that for that Cape Town meeting. So the 6 countries are listed up here. And for today's presentation, we'll just put Canada to the side because they got involved a little bit later. So we haven't got all the information from them yet. So we'll just talk about, in my slides, I'm going to talk about the 4 that aren't New Zealand. And just to set the scene and show you the relative smoking prevalence of the different countries, this is from 2015, just because that was the most recent date that I had comparable information for. And the slide's showing women, and just on a technical thing, the Scottish figure is from somewhere else and is current smoking, because someone might be able to correct me on this, but the main survey that they're recommending we use doesn't actually state what the daily smoking is, so it's current smoking, which is a bit odd. But basically you can see New Zealand's in the middle of the pack compared to those other countries, and the more recent information that we have from Canada and Sweden is that both of them have dropped below 10% to around 9% now, and Finland's down to 13% and we're down to 14%. So that's all for daily smoking of both genders, not just women. So looking at the countries in this collaboration, they all have a stated focus on reducing disparities in their strategies at least. So just looking at Scotland and Ireland as examples, Scotland's got some quite good concrete examples of how they're enacting a priority on disparities in this work. So they have specified targets by deprivation group, and it's going down to about 5 levels of deprivation. which is similar to what we do for ethnicity here. We just have targets for Māori and Pacific communities. But Scotland, does it in more detail in terms of deprivation. And they also carried out a health inequalities impact assessment on the implementation of their strategy. So that's been completed now, and they've had consultations with the stakeholders that are involved with implementation to share that learning and to really apply that as part of the work. And Ireland also has a high priority on reducing both socioeconomic and ethnic disparities in terms of the traveller or gypsy population, which has quite high, relatively very high smoking prevalence. Most of the, generally all of these countries have the Empower measures, which are things like raising tax and having health warnings and smoking cessation, etc. But there are some differences in the extent of those, which I'll talk about. And there are restrictions on additives coming in the EU countries and also Canada. But aside from that, none of the countries have really introduced any novel major endgame initiatives that we've mentioned. So that is still to come and still unknown in terms of these particular countries. So I'll just mention some of the highlights and interventions that are over and above those traditional Empower measures. Finland's got some really unique features. They have a comprehensive goal that covers both tobacco and all nicotine products. So that includes e-cigarettes. So their goal is to get to less than 5% for all nicotine products. They've had the strategy since 2010, so quite a long time, a little bit longer than us. And it's about to be updated with a new strategy shortly. Some of their interventions include tax increases twice a year, which is unusual compared to other countries. They've got retail licensing, and they've got relatively strong regulation of e-cigarettes. So they regulate them pretty much as though they are traditional cigarettes in terms of smoke-free areas. Any smoke-free area is also vape-free. And they have licensing for retail, and they restrict the amount of nicotine that's allowed, and they've got heavy restrictions on importing and no cross-border distance sales. They don't have standardised packaging yet, and interestingly, they've had few mass media campaigns in recent years, so that hasn't been a strong feature of their work. And they have a network, which is an organised partnership between NGOs and government, which is quite heavily involved with the strategy, including implementing actions that are part of the strategy. And they also have a strong cross-sectoral approach within government. So there's an intersectoral working group that monitors the strategy and that does regular updates of it. So this 2018 is one of a number of updated strategies that have come through. So moving to Ireland, they've got a similar goal to us and had a strategy in place since 2013. And they, like Finland, take quite a strong cross-sectoral approach. And interestingly, they have a dedicated tobacco-free program, which actually sits outside the Department of Health. So they've got their tobacco and alcohol control unit in the department, but then in the separate HSE, the Health Services Executive, they have a specific program unit that is doing the tobacco-free Ireland implementation. In terms of the strategy, there's mention of alternative nicotine products, but they're still developing a formal government position on harm reduction, but that's due out later this year. And on the ground, e-cigarettes are widely available. Some of their interventions include standardised packaging and smoke-free cars fully implemented and planned retail licensing. And like Finland, they have a tobacco control partners group, which again is a formal organised partnership between government and NGOs to work on the strategy and progressing that. And moving north to Scotland, they have a similar goal but slightly later date, and they've got a new strategy that's due very soon as well, but their current strategy is still in place. They haven't got a strategy statement on alternative products, but again, on the ground, they've got rising use of e-cigarettes. And some of their interesting interventions include a minimum retail price policy, which is aiming at reducing the impact of budget brands being used as a way to counter tax increases. And as far as I know, this is the only country in the world that's tried this policy yet. It's quite new, so we'll be very interested to see what effect that has. And in their strategy, they also gave a 5-year funding commitment where they committed to no reductions in tobacco control funding for the life of the 5-year strategy. And similarly to the other countries, they have a charter for a tobacco-free generation, which a wide range of organisations have signed pledges of support for, and they're nearly up to 200 organisations, and it's very diverse, like right across society, and it includes government agencies and the NHS, as well as a wide range of NGOs. And so finally, Sweden, who also have some very distinctive features. Their goal's the same as ours, but they've had a much more recent strategy, and it doesn't contain any specific actions, and no separate action plan has happened yet, but the NGOs are advocating for that, for sure. And as I mentioned, they have got low smoking prevalence, but they've also got very widespread use of snus. It's hardly, so snus is an oral smokeless tobacco product, which has been historically in Sweden for a long time, but it's mainly used by men. I think the women's use is negligible, but there is nearly 20% of men using it daily, so that is quite significant. Some of the standard Empower measures aren't in place, so their tax increases are quite insufficient and they don't have major mass media campaigns. They're also only just working on getting point of sale display bans in place, so that's a very new emerging thing. And they have had an extensive opinion building exercise, but I think compared to the other ones, this is more driven by NGOs. So it's not a formal partnership with the government as such, but the regional level health authorities have come on board recently and signed it, which was seen as a really positive development. But it's similar to Scotland in having nearly 200 wide, diverse organisations signed up to it. And so just summing up my section of the presentation, all 4 countries have got strategies, even though they vary a bit in their strength and specificity, and stated equity statements, but again, there's probably variety in that. They have varying approaches regarding harm reduction, with Finland standing out as the one country that's taking an explicit abstinence approach to try and tackle both products at the same time. And aside from removing additives, there's no cutting-edge novel interventions emerging as yet. And I think for me, one of the things that stands out from what we've done so far is just looking at the extent to which particularly Finland, Scotland and Ireland have got these formal structures in place, both within government in terms of working across quite a few sectors and also between government and NGOs. So I'll finish mine now, and Richard is going to talk some more about the main learnings from the project and relating it to our goal.
Thank you, Louise. Kia ora, Tato. So yes, I'm going to go through some of the advantages and disadvantages that people thought about endgame goals, and then just unpick a bit more some of those learnings from this, particularly the enabling factors that were identified, and also some of the challenges. So in terms of advantages and disadvantages, there's a whole bunch of advantages. Some of these are potential advantages, they're not necessarily realised as yet. But an endgame goal can give a very clear clarity of purpose, that we want to get rid of tobacco, can give it enhanced focus on what we're doing. It potentially could increase political and public support, and it could enhance the amount of tobacco control activity. If it has a strong inequalities or disparities focus, then it could highlight the importance of no one being left behind. And I guess the ultimate one is it could result in greater reductions or faster reductions in smoking prevalence and smoking related harms, but that's sort of to be seen. There were some disadvantages raised, which was, if we have an end game goal, will that distract us from just doing the things that we need to get on with and do, and too much focus on the goal? Some people talked about the long-term nature of goals. It could be, it could become difficult to maintain the momentum because they're so far off. And what happens if we fail? And that's quite pertinent given some discussions that are around today. You know, will that be demotivating and inspire sort of nihilism about, oh, we just can't do this? So those are potential advantages and disadvantages. So in terms of the enablers, so these are some of the things that have come out, I think, from across there, and then what's the position with those enablers in New Zealand. So the first one is political commitment, political support, sustained political support. That seems to be pretty clear. Everyone agrees that's needed. And ideally that's cross-party, that's at high level, at ministerial level. And it's also at different levels, in national level, regional, local levels. And indeed, in several of the other countries, there was clear evidence that there was strong political support. In New Zealand, this is our assessment. We'd have to say that under the last government, it was probably patchy. At times it was very strong, particularly when Aotearoa was in post, but a bit uncertain. And with the new government, we don't really know yet. We sort of have hopes that it will be stronger, but we don't know that for sure. But what we can say, there's been very strong Maori political leadership at every level, and that's been a key driver, whether through the Maori Affairs Select Committee and other means. And there's some local examples of strong political commitment. And there's some interesting new developments, such as the cross-party group that of MPs that Ash has been setting up. So just to underline the key support for this across from Maori leadership. And this is just examples of things going on at local level. There's lots of enthusiasm and at political and community level all around the country. So the second major enabler, I think, is the presence of a government strategy or action plan, or whatever you want to call it. So these are in place in all the other 4 countries. And 2 of the countries, Scotland and Finland, are about to be going on to their second one. So, I mean, I think we have to say that compared to New Zealand, they are way ahead of us. We have no strategy under the last government, despite at one stage a commitment to produce one, which never eventuated. The Maori Affairs Select Committee clearly recommended such a strategy, and the tobacco control sector has recommended that and has produced strategies like the National Smokefree Working Group's next steps, and then the ASAP strategy that Louise talked about. So we've got to say that there we haven't got an officially endorsed government strategy, but then the Minister Salesa announced that that was the intention, so that's really good news. I think that one is going to be developed. In terms of implementation of interventions, as Louise was pointing out, most of these countries have got the sort of standard suite of Empower type interventions, but largely haven't got the leading edge ones. And really, apart from the additive removal, so as a product modification thing, there's not actually doesn't seem a lot of evidence that they're moving towards sort of more radical leading edge interventions at the moment, but of course that may change. And I think we'd probably say similar in New Zealand, that most of the sort of standard things are in place. Obviously, standardized packaging's just come in as an additional one. And we can say that the leading edge policies are under discussion, and they were certainly included in the ASAP plan. So this was our list of things in the ASAP plan, and we included all of the major leading edge interventions. But that's the recommendations from this part of the tobacco control sector. And of course, it's not a government endorsed thing. And there's like with some of the other countries, some things are not done quite so well. And I think mass media would be one example where we documented how the expenditure on mass media went down after the adoption of the goal, which always seems to me fairly incredible. But hopefully, again, that's something that may change. Another strong theme was this idea of cross-sectoral activities, a strong NGO sector and an engaged NGO sector, a partnership between NGO sector and the government. So that was really described for pretty much all of the 4 countries that we looked at. In New Zealand, I think probably say that we have got a strong NGO sector, but coordination and integration with government is probably fairly weak. And in fact, two things have recently that were enhancing that coordination have been lost. So the Smokefree Coalition and the National Smokefree Working Group. And we don't have a sort of a formal mechanism of engagement in the way that some of these other countries have, of incorporation of the NGO sector with the government. I would say that cross-sectoral activities have been somewhat limited in New Zealand. There have been some really good examples, such as the Smoke-Free Defence Forces and Smoke-Free Prisons. But I'm not sure they represent a sort of cross-government approach rather than individual organisations or departments deciding to do something. And I certainly think that was the case with the Smoke-Free Defence Force, and I think that was probably true with corrections and prisons as well. And this is one of the things that Louise mentioned, this charter for a tobacco-free generation, which is, it's quite incredible what they're doing in Scotland there, how they've managed to engage government, private sector, all sorts of organisations together around Scotland's goal. That has not happened in New Zealand. But as I said, we have had some examples. We do have strong public support, evidence of strong public support for these goals in all of the countries, and certainly that's true in New Zealand. And so there's overwhelming support. So the bar graph on the left is the goal, and you've got 80% support versus 5% disagreeing. And then there's this focus on disparities, which is present in all of the countries. I think it's particularly strong in Scotland. If you read their strategy, it's really absolutely infused with reducing inequalities in health. Ireland, as Louise said, it's very strong there as well, but it's present in all. And I think in New Zealand we can say the same, that it's a strong focus. The fact that we've got specific interim targets, which I think is the only country to have actual disparities specific targets. So that's apart from Scotland. Yeah, for ethnicity, yeah. But as in the other countries, there's inadequate progress in reducing those inequalities or disparities. So some good things, but also there's the same problem as elsewhere, that we're not getting there fast enough for Maori and Pacific in particular in New Zealand. And this is just a slide from a paper that we did showing that last year. And this has meant some people are questioning whether the goal is achievable, and actually some people today are questioning whether the goal is achievable. So there's an editorial by Mike Daub in the New Zealand Medical Journal who seems to come to the conclusion that it's not achievable. So I think that's a bit of a wake-up call, as are graphs like this. Robust monitoring and review. Again, this is a strong feature in the four countries. So in Scotland and Ireland, they have annual progress monitoring. And the reason I put new strategies there is that they've decided, they're not on track, so they're putting in place new strategies, which is ultimately what you do the monitoring and review for. As I said, there are interim targets here, and they're obviously coming up this year, and we assume they're going to be missed by a large margin. The Ministry did report back to the Maori Affairs Select Committee in 2016, but there wasn't a great change in approach as a result of that. And I'm not aware of other formal review procedures, but obviously I hope there'll be some sort of review procedure against the interim targets, so we'll see what form that takes. And then evidence generation, evaluation, and so on. Each of these countries has a moderate or strong research infrastructure. So for example, in Scotland, it's really pretty strong. Several universities with major research groups looking at this, and they're part of the UK Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies. And I think in New Zealand, we'd probably say we've got a pretty strong research sector. So there is evidence generation. I don't think that, the commitment to policy evaluation, I think, is patchy. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes major interventions come in place and they're not very well or proactively evaluated. And that's not just true of tobacco control. It's in a lot of sectors, I think. So those are the enablers and where we're at with them in New Zealand. There's also a bunch of challenges or threats that were identified through the participants. So competing political priorities, so it can be lack of political will, but sometimes there's just a lot of other stuff going on. And we see it with Middlemore Hospital, whatever it is, the latest thing at the moment. There's other things that occupy politicians' minds and the media, of course. There's the challenge of maintaining momentum with long-term goals was raised. whether there's adequate resources for the interventions that are put in place, and the issue of persisting disparities. Are we doing enough to address those? And then at the last two were potential challenges and threats of lack of unity in the tobacco control community, public health community, and then of course always there's the threat of tobacco industry tactics and interference. And we've seen, you know, the delay in plain packaging in New Zealand is maybe a pretty good example of that. It's taken 6 years or so to follow Australia. So conclusions, there is a heterogeneity of contexts and goals and approaches across these 5 countries, and obviously in Canada as well. There's noticeably very different approaches to harm reduction, with Finland at one end and perhaps Scotland, or it's not explicit at the moment, but I suspect it will be more towards the other end. So I don't think we should be looking at a one-size-fits-all solution to achieving these goals, but there are a lot of similarities in the enablers and the challenges. So some of the implications for New Zealand, the usual things really. We desperately need that political commitment, but I think we also need some ways of enhancing the sort of organisation and things like cross-sectoral working and integration of the NGO and the tobacco control sector would be good. We obviously need an intensification of what we're doing to achieve Smokefree 2025 and to reduce disparities. And that's why we think that it desperately needs to be a strategy. And as we said, we're the only country of the 5 that doesn't have a strategy. And that strategy would need to detail that intensification of the sort of current interventions like mass media and so on, but also we would suggest implementation of some leading edge radical interventions. It needs to have a clear focus on reducing Maori and Pacific. That needs to be the priority. And we need to think about how e-cigarettes and policy on e-cigarettes is employed in a way to complement the other measures. And we need robust monitoring, evaluation and review. So, Kiora, I'd be very happy to take questions, and thank you for coming and listening.
We've got 15 minutes for questions, so I think I'll leave you going.
Okay. So, Jeff.
Could you say a little bit more about what leading edge strategies possibilities are? Could you say a little bit more about what new leading edge strategies and possibilities there are past tax measures and
okay, so the 3 sort of main areas we detail in the ASAP report are product modification. So the product is really pretty much unregulated at the moment. So the leading candidates there are to take the nicotine out of cigarettes, or virtually take the nicotine out of cigarettes. Another one is to take all the additives or remove filters and filter venting to make the product less palatable. So those are things that the FDA has recently proposed, introducing, getting rid of the nicotine, but otherwise it's not been done in a mandated way. So there's that whole product modification, which is currently an area that's not really addressed in any substantial way. There's reducing the supply of tobacco products. So at the moment it's pretty ubiquitous. You know, it's available in every dairy and every gas station, every supermarket. That's, if you think about it, you know, that's nuts. Why do we allow this product to be so ubiquitously available? So there is some things going on around the world, for example, in Hungary, where they've really massively reduced availability, and some other approaches that have been mooted often at subnational level. Some cities in the US, for example. But those reductions, to do that, you really need to have very substantial reductions to make a difference, and modelling by Frederica and the Bode team demonstrate that. But we really haven't addressed supply in any meaningful way. So those are probably the 2 biggest sort of areas that have not been addressed. The third one is the tax and price. You can, another radical thing is to really increase the price dramatically, or to do some other measures like minimum price and things to maximise the impact and prevent the tobacco industry shifting prices so that budget brands don't go up in price, so people can shift down and roll your own and as a cheap alternative and so on. So those are the sorts of things that are being discussed, but say not widely implemented yet.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really
Philippa?
And thank you. I really enjoyed it, both of you. It's great to be able to catch up with all the work that you've been doing. I've just come from a Motu carbon mitigation meeting, which was interesting. And one of the points that was discussed is about how you do these collaborative endeavours and working with government and so forth. So the themes were much the same. And I just wonder if you could, what your views are about the effectiveness of working within one sector, like tobacco control, as against joining with other sectors. And I think of the conversation that we had briefly, Richard, that 60% of people smoke in Housing New Zealand houses. Whether we try and focus on particular settings and make, as the case with the Salvation Army bods who work with people who come out of prison, how much that should be. We should have efforts that one might engage the ministers more if they have to have a particular interest in prisons or those kind of things. So I just wondered how you felt overall about this kind of, I hesitate to say narrow, but sort of strategy focusing in one area about trying to think more broadly about collaboration.
Well, I think we often do think quite narrowly in tobacco control. I mean, I think we try and think about complementary things. So, for example, alcohol is a really obvious example. There's very much synergy between tobacco and alcohol. And so, in fact, one of the most effective measures might be if we just reduce alcohol consumption, that would probably reduce smoking or smoking initiation, things like that. So I do think we should be thinking across, if you like, risk factor sectors like that. But there's that broader thing that you're talking about. I guess we should always be thinking about that in public health and trying not to be too narrow. I suppose the temptation is it's just you've got this very obvious and in some ways simple risk factor, which if you could just take that away, smoking, that seems like a sort of almost like a low-hanging fruit, something that's achievable. And sometimes some of the broader societal changes are much more complex and difficult. So I think you want to do both. And actually the broader societal reducing poverty or improving housing or whatever will have positive effects on all sorts of, if you like, risk factor areas as well. But I suppose just as a group, we're focused on tobacco, but I think I agree we should be always having that that ability to think outside of that, and how can we integrate with other sectors, or how can we think of other broader interventions that rather than denicotinizing cigarettes or a specific one. I guess it's just getting the balance between those two. And it also depends on the political opportunities, I think. I mean, sometimes you've just got an opportunity with something like alcohol and you think, well, okay, let's go for that because we can actually do something there. I think in public health, you do have to be a little bit opportunistic as well as having a broader strategy and looking at the big picture. Sometimes you just have to identify an opportunity and say, well, we better do that because this might be our one chance.
Can I just quickly say, I know that in the Irish example, they do have a specific strategy on the tobacco endgame, but it is part of a program for partnership government, which sounds like a really integrated approach to doing a lot of policy work, and it just sounds a lot more integrated than what we have at that government level. And Sweden's strategy is also broader, but just in terms of products like alcohol and illegal drugs. So they group all of those together. But yeah, I agree that moving outside our particular area is really valuable, and that needs to happen a lot more in terms of joining, particularly with sectors like housing and mental health, where there's obviously much, much higher smoking rates.
So, Louise,
Kristen.
And Kristen, and then Bernadette.
Thanks awfully. Just a thought sparked off a little bit by Philippus, but also relating back to kind of the ideas about framing. And we're very used in the tobacco control community to thinking about tax and tobacco as only meaning increasing tax on tobacco. But I wonder, again, sparked off by Philippa and the idea of framing, is we could also think about tax in a different way with tobacco, and that is by reducing tax not on tobacco, but on other areas that would enhance, which would decrease inequalities and decrease poverty. So a tax measure for tobacco, but indirect, admittedly, could involve reducing tax on income tax for lower income people, or reducing GST tax for on everything, and thus with the desired goal of reducing inequalities and poverty, etc., which would hopefully, in the long term, I know we don't have evidence perhaps specifically for that, but of actually enabling people to stay smoke-free better and not initiate it better, maybe. But the other kind of idea that entails for me is that framing tax as not in the normal way that people expect of tobacco control people, oh, well, we can get rid of this before we just sort of make it, heaps more expensive, but framing tax as a more positive way by actually giving people more.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of a poverty reduction policy, whether that's through tax or benefits or whatever, I think, would have multiple public health benefits. And maybe it should be, when we are talking about putting up tobacco tax, maybe that should be something that's put in place at the same time as an ameliorating thing for the economic hardships that can occur for people who continue to smoke who are disadvantaged. I mean, I think almost everyone in public health would agree with a sort of redistributive tax or benefits or those sorts of policies as a public health measure. Yeah. Kristen.
Louise and Richard, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed the comparison with New Zealand and Scandinavian countries. It's refreshing to see that, because often we get compared with Australia and the UK, obviously, and the States. So great to see us compared with the Scandinavian countries. My question is around the two, I guess, the last two dot points on your challenge and threat slide. Are you able to just shift back to that?
So that was the
yes.
tobacco industry and
yes, and the lack of unity. So my question is, do you think the tobacco industry is actively tried to destroy the unity in the tobacco control sector? And if so, how can we go about, I guess, building unity and getting us all back on the same page? And presumably it's to do with that strategy that you talked about, but I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I would guess they are. Because why wouldn't they? I mean, if you were the tobacco industry, of course, some of your most effective opposition comes from the tobacco control community, and there's internal documents from I think it was called the Sunrise Project that Philip Morris changed their spots apparently, where they explicitly talk about that's their biggest problem, and so they want to do things that drive a wedge between people within the tobacco control community. So I would assume that's what they're doing, and we should be aware of that. How do we counter it? I mean, I think that requires leadership from people in the tobacco control community and willingness to listen to each other and not shout and denigrate each other and recognise. So, for example, the e-cigarette debate, of course, is the big thing. So one of the things I would say is that, regardless of the rights and wrongs of e-cigarettes and whether they're a good thing or a bad thing in terms of helping people to quit or whatever, I do think they have a potential downside in fracturing the tobacco control community. And I think pretty undeniably they've done that. That's not the fault of e-cigarettes. That's what's happened. But maybe the tobacco industry is using that. So I think we need to really guard against that. And given the uncertainty about the impacts of e-cigarettes at a population level, we should acknowledge the fact that different opinions are perfectly legitimate, and that we should have debates, but not name calling and questioning people's motives and so on. So I do think it comes down to us being smart as a tobacco control community, but also people throughout the community showing that leadership and restraint, and ability to listen to other people and acknowledge other people have legitimate positions. That'd be my view. Sorry, before Bernadette was, come to you, Steve. And perhaps make that Stephen, the last question.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's really clear the benefits of what the benefits of your research are going to be and are already having. I'm really interested if you can talk to us a little bit about the unintended consequences. and particularly around any evidence for increases in black market supply and increases in marijuana smoking, for example?
Well, the black market, so you're thinking there maybe of the tax increases and resulting in black market. I mean, well, New Zealand doesn't have a very big problem at the moment with black market tobacco compared to other jurisdictions. So in Europe, because of the porous borders, it's a much bigger problem. But I think what most people would say who study tobacco tax is that increases in the illicit market doesn't have to follow tax increases. And remember that the tobacco industry has been caught many times actually aiding the black market. So they put out all this stuff about all these seizures and how terrible it is, but they're quite happy to export their cigarettes to places like Andorra in Europe in vast quantities, and then they just wash their hands of what happens to them. And of course, they're smuggled back into other countries. So the tobacco industry has been, when it suits them, they support the black market covertly. When it doesn't suit them, when it's undermining their things, then they will make all these statements about it. So I think, but what's happened, for example, in the UK, where the taxes are very high, like here, and they do have these porous borders, what they've done is they've done much better enforcement and border control, and there's been a big reduction in the illicit share of the market in the UK. So if you put in place the appropriate measures, you can deal with black market. But in New Zealand, because of our isolation and our strong borders, it's not been a substantial problem so far. I mean, of course, there are other unintended consequences, and one of the things at the moment is about dairy robberies and so on is another possible one. And as I said, the economic effects on disadvantaged people who continue to smoke. So it's not so, most policies have some sort of downside to them. Obviously, you want to think about, well, do those downsides, are they justified by the benefits? And are there ways to implement the policy in such a way that you minimize those downsides or bring in other policies to address them? So, but I think we can do that, be smart. But if there are clear adverse outcomes that outweigh the benefits, then of course we shouldn't do it. And sorry, Stephen is, I did say.
Last one. Thanks, Richard. In terms of what you just mentioned, the tax increases and robberies of dairies, and I was wondering if anyone's done an analysis to see if it's cost effective to still have tobacco in store in dairies when some of them have been robbed 4 or 5 times in the space of about 18 months. Because if it isn't, it's actually a selling point for getting rid of it. So. Well, as you probably know, we're quite in favour of getting tobacco out of dairies and out of lots of other places. So I do think, the narrative is about the moment is dairies are maybe are having increased robberies, and there's not very good data on that, but it's probably true. I don't know, Lee's not certain, but maybe. And some of those will have tobacco as part of the robbery, but they have other things as well. And but there's this media narrative, which I suspect has been stoked by the tobacco industry, because it's a tactic that they commonly use. So they're making this as a really, really big thing. And of course, the people who are affected, it is a big thing. But is the response to that putting smoke cannons and things in dairies or police on the doors, or is it saying we won't let them be sold in every little corner shop which is vulnerable to this sort of thing? Put them in places where it's less vulnerable. So I'd say the latter, but that would be part of a strategy to reduce supply. So you have it only from very few places, and those places could then have adequate security and so on, and you would reduce supply, reduce uptake, and enhance quitting, and you'd also reduce robberies. So it seems to me a win-win-win.
Thanks, Richard and Louise. I think there's a real tour de force of this area, and I just love the sophistication you're bringing to this task of managing tobacco in New Zealand. And I think all of us, I always sit here thinking all of us can learn so much from that sophistication you've got in terms of approaches. And I think the tobacco industry has a lot to worry about. So thank you.